Take a look at this. A single black volcanic peak rising out of the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, halfway between South America and Africa. There's no other land within 1,500 miles. No airport, no harbor deep enough for a cruise ship. You can only get to this rock by sailing for 6 or 7 days from Cape Town, and only when the ocean lets you. And yet on this lonely piece of stone, 240 people are living lives almost nobody else on Earth has ever seen. They share 7 family names between them. They speak an English last heard on a St. Helena dock 200 years ago. They lock no doors. They leave keys in their cars. And in 1961, when their volcano woke up and almost ended them, they spent 18 months living in modern England. And then they voted, almost unanimously, to come back home to the volcano. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. When I first found this place on a map, I felt something I didn't expect. It wasn't curiosity, it was a quiet kind of envy. Because once you understand what's happening on this rock, you can't unsee it. This is one of the last places left on Earth where a small group of human beings have looked at the modern world and at the way they have always lived and chosen the old way. Not because they didn't have the choice, they were handed it on a silver platter, and they said no. This is Tristan da Cunha, the story of an island that refused to leave itself behind. For most of human history, there was nothing on this rock at all. A Portuguese admiral named Tristan da Cunha sighted it in 1506. He'd on his way to India, and he named it after himself because that was what European explorers did. The sea was too rough to land. He sailed on. For the next 300 years, almost nobody came here. The Dutch made a few stops for water. A French expedition mapped it in 1767. The world went on. The rock stayed empty. Then in 1816, the British arrived. Napoleon Bonaparte had just been sent into exile on the island of St. Helena, 1,500 miles to the north, and the British were terrified that French loyalists would try to mount a rescue. They saw this little volcanic rock sitting between St. Helena and South America, and they decided to put a garrison on it. 5 officers and 36 soldiers landed in November of that year, raised the British flag, and waited. A Napoleon died on St. Helena in 1821 without ever being rescued, and the garrison was withdrawn before anyone even thought he would. But before they left, one of the soldiers asked permission to stay. His name was William Glass. He was a corporal in the Royal Artillery. He was 30 years old from a little town called Kelso in the Scottish borders, and the man who had left for the army at 18 had given his last name as Glass instead of his real name Glasgow, and lied about his age, and nobody has ever known exactly why. Some say he ran from a debt. Some say he ran from a girl. He never told anyone. What we do know is that William Glass had a Cape-colored wife from South Africa named Maria Magdalena, and they had 2 small children, and they all wanted to stay on this rock at the end of the world. 2 stonemasons from Plymouth agreed to stay with them. On the 7th of November, 1817, the 4 men sat down with a piece of paper and wrote out, in their own hands, the rules of the world they were about to build. Everything would be shared. Stock, supplies, labor, profit, everything. No one would be superior to another. No one would be richer than his neighbor. They called it the firm. They signed it. And they began. Just think about that for a moment. 3 uneducated men on a rock in the middle of the ocean sat down and wrote one of the earliest egalitarian constitutions in modern history. They did it 30 years before the Communist Manifesto. And they didn't do it for politics or philosophy. They did it because I'm on a lonely island where the next ship might not come for 2 years. Treating each other as equals was the only way to survive. The community grew slowly. Glass eventually had 16 children. In 1827, a passing whaling captain brought 5 women from St. Helena to be wives for the unmarried men. Those women brought their own English with them, an old St. Helena dialect, and that dialect is the reason islanders still greet each other today with the phrase, "How you is." In the years that followed, a shipwrecked Dutch sailor anglicized his name to Green and stayed. 2 American whalers stayed. In 1892, an Italian ship caught fire off the coast, and 2 of the survivors refused to go back to Italy because they had fallen in love with 2 Tristan women. Those 7 men are the reason almost everyone on this island today shares one of 7 last names. Their blood runs through every family. And then on the 27th of November, 1885, this little community almost ended. The potatoes had failed that year. Stores were almost empty. When a passing iron ship called the West Riding was sighted off the coast, 15 of the island's adult men, almost every grown male on Tristan, climbed into a new lifeboat. They loaded it with their best sheep and their last potatoes. They rowed out to trade for flour. The men of the West Riding saw them come alongside. They watched the lifeboat pull away. That lifeboat was never seen again. What happened on board has never been proven. The most likely answer is the simplest one. The sea took them. But to this day, no piece of the boat has ever been found, no body has ever washed ashore. The 15 men just stopped existing. When the next ship called at Tristan on Boxing Day a month later, it found a village of 92 people. 13 women had been made widows. Dozens of children had lost their fathers. Out of the entire community, only 4 adult men were left alive. 2 of them were in their 70s. The whole island, in one afternoon, had become a place of women and children and old men. They could have left. The British government offered them free passage to Cape Town a few years later, and 10 people took it. But the rest stayed. They rebuilt. They taught their sons to fish. The Suez Canal had opened a few years earlier, and ships stopped coming past Tristan altogether on their way to the east. The world forgot about them. For most of the next 60 years, this place lived in silence. No mail, no visitors, no news. The First World War passed by entirely without them knowing it had started. And then, in the summer of 1961, the rock itself betrayed them. It began with small tremors in August. By October, large fissures had opened in the ground behind the lighthouse, and the earth was starting to rise. On the 8th of October, a major landslide hit the eastern side of the village, and families had to run, overnight, to the homes of relatives on the western side. The next morning, a long crack opened up between the village and the crayfish factory, and the ground around it began to swell. The volcano they had always thought was sleeping was waking up. On the 10th of October, the entire community gathered in the village hall. And the administrator told them they had to leave. All 264 of them. That night, they piled into 2 small fishing boats and sailed to a neighboring island and slept on the rocks. The next morning, by a piece of timing nobody could believe, a Dutch passenger ship called the Tristan, on its way to pick up 2 Tristan girls for hospital treatment, happened to find them. It took them all to Cape Town. From there, they boarded the RMS Stirling Castle, and on the 3rd of November, they walked off the gangplank at Southampton into the cold and the smoke of a country none of them had ever seen. The British government, very quietly, had already decided the evacuation was permanent. They thought of St. Kilda, the lonely Scottish island whose people had been evacuated in 1930 and had never come home. They housed the islanders in wooden huts in Surrey and then in an old Air Force base called Calshot on the Hampshire coast. The 18 months that followed broke something in them. It wasn't that the English were unkind. They were kind. They gave them jobs. They invited them into their homes. But everyone wanted to look at them. Linguists came to study their language. Doctors came to study their lungs because the islanders were starting to get asthma from the smog. Sociologists came to ask them about communal living. Television cameras came to film them shopping in supermarkets. We were specimens, one of them said, much later. We were not people anymore. 3 of them died in England. One was a man named Robert Glass, 73 years old, a great-grandson of the William Glass, who had signed the firm in 1817. He was buried in the Hampshire soil, 7,000 miles from where his family belonged. Then in the autumn of 1962, a small advance party sailed back to Tristan to see if the village could be saved. They sent word that it could, and the British government was forced to give the islanders a choice, a secret ballot. Stay in modern England with all of its medicine and television and supermarkets, or sail back to the volcano. 148 voted to go home. 5 voted to stay. One of the men who voted to leave, Basil Lavarello, was 30 years old. He had a job. He had electricity. He had a roof that didn't leak. When a reporter asked him why he was going back to a place that had nearly destroyed his community, he said something I have never been able to forget. He said the television was making him mad. He said the cars and the buses and the trains roared like thunder through his brain. He said that way back in Tristan, a man could come to grips with his soul and his creator. Another islander said what he hated most about England was walking down the street among all those strange faces and nobody saying hello. They sailed back in November of 1963. The village was wrecked. The crayfish factory was gone. The sheep were dead. They began again with their bare hands, just as William Glass had done 146 years before them. Today, around 240 people still live on this rock. They have one school, one doctor, one police officer, one pub called the Albatross Bar. No traffic lights, no door locks. The cars in the village still have their keys in the ignition. The children still play in the road. The 7 family names that arrived on shipwrecks in the 1800s still answer the door when you knock. They are still farming potatoes in the same communal field William Glass cleared with his hands in 1817. And here's the thing about Tristan that people on the outside have always misunderstood. The world has often called this place lonely, or primitive, or sad. But the people who live on it have looked at the world the rest of us live in, and at the world they made for themselves on this rock. And they chose the rock. They chose it on purpose. They chose it together. They chose it after watching television and walking through supermarkets and feeling deep in their souls that something was missing. Sometimes the smallest places hold the biggest stories. And this lonely volcanic rock in the South Atlantic holds the story of 7 shipwrecked families who, when handed the keys to the modern world, gave them back. It holds the story of a Scottish corporal who wrote a constitution of equality at the end of the earth. It holds the story of 15 men who rode out one morning and never came home. And it holds the answer to a question almost no one else has been brave enough to ask. Which is better? The thing we have, or the thing we have lost? If you've ever heard of Tristan da Cunha, or you know someone who has set foot on it, let me know in the comments. And let me know where I should go next. See you in the next one.